Few news stories received more coverage in the later half of 2017 than the orgy of denunciations known as the Metoo movement. What started promisingly enough with a series of Hollywood scandals involving high-profile Jews rapidly spilled over into the world at large, culminating in a mass hysteria that was unprecedented in recent memory. A number of striking parallels to the so-called Metoo movement, and by extension, feminism as a whole, can be found in Euripides' most famous tragedy, the Bacchae. Written around the 5th century BC, the play is, ostensibly, a cautionary tale warning the reader of the fate that befalls those who disobey the gods. In it, Dionysus, appearing in human form, drives the women of Thebes to madness as a result of the refusal to acknowledge his divinity, setting off a chain of events that will leave the Theban king dead and his female subjects in exile. It is in part due to its depiction of a conflict divided along gender lines that the Bacchae continues to be the object of study besides its purely literary historical value. There is an element of hysteria in all mass movements, and the frenzied pace of the accusations associated with the MeToo hashtag cannot but invite a comparison with the events of the Bacchae. In the play, Euripides attributes to Dionysus the power to manipulate the minds of mortals. Under his spell, the citizens of Thebes, its women first and foremost, lose the ability to distinguish between gods, men, and beasts. A similar confusion has also followed the recent waves of sexual harassment allegations. For example, a study published by the Université Laval in Quebec City, Canada, suggests that a staggering 40% of its students have been victims of quote-unquote sexual violence. Although the study was widely reported in the provincial media, its results are dubious for a number of reasons. Most egregiously, the use of the phrase sexual violence, a formulation that was subsequently repeated verbatim by the media, to include acts ranging from the innocuous, lingering stares, lewd comments, to the downright felonious, sexual coercion and violent rape, reveals either an incapacity or an unwillingness to differentiate between normal and abnormal male behavior, or, in other words, between man and beast. As mentioned earlier, a recurring motif in the Bacchae is that of hallucination or mistaking one thing for another, animals being confused with men and vice versa. Most revealing, however, is Euripides' choice of animals and the symbolism therein. At one point, Pentheus, the Theban king, believing he has Dionysus before him, is tricked into shackling a bull instead. Later in the text, the king, still under the god's spell, begins to see double: 2 cities, 2 suns, and 2 horns protruding from Dionysus' head. Being, among other things, the god of natural growth and of fertility, Dionysus was long associated with the bull, so the previous passage is fairly straightforward. The delirious state of Pentheus enabled him to see beneath the god's mortal disguise and perceive his true identity. This link between the symbol of the bull and fertility is stressed once again in a particularly gruesome passage when the horde of frenzied women known collectively as the Maenads tear a herd of cattle limb from limb, mistaking the animals for the king's army. Pentheus' messenger, having witnessed the horrific scene, speaks of red rain from the deep green pines, bulls of pride flung stumbling by multitudinous hands dragged pitilessly. Compare this slaughter of the herd with the event that immediately follows. Consumed by bloodlust, the Maenads return to the city and snatch its children from their homes. Although Euripides does not specifically mention the fate of the children, one may well infer a grisly end given the context. 3rd century writer Antonius Liberalis depicts a similar scene in greater detail, allowing us to fill in the blanks. The Maenads refuse to participate in the worship of Dionysus. Here too, the god finally compels them to do so, and in their madness they cast lots to decide which of their sons they should sacrifice. Then they tore the chosen one limb from limb. In the tragedy's climactic scene, Dionysus tricks Pentheus into volunteering for a suicide mission, to spy on the Maenads himself with, as his sole defense, a crude disguise of women's clothes. Upon discovering his presence, the madwomen, led by Pentheus' own mother Agave, unperturbed by her son's pleading, converge on the intruder and dismember him with swift hands ensanguined, as they had the children and the cattle. Again, the image of the bull is superimposed on that of the man. The Maenads, following their grisly deed, proclaim, "Yea, the wild ivy lapped him, and the doomed wild bull of sacrifice before him loomed," whereas Agave, still unaware of her infanticide, cradles her son's head and utters, See, the hair of the wild bull's crest, the young steer of the fell. Dionysus' retribution, therefore, must be interpreted as a form of poetic justice. As punishment for denying the existence of the god of fertility, Thebes is driven by Dionysus to sterilize itself threefold. First, whereas the cult of Dionysus was mainly practiced by widows, unmarried women, and other outcasts, the god drives the entire female population of Thebes outside the city, that is, outside the gene pool. Secondly, by killing the city's children, the Maenads eliminate Thebes' ability to replenish itself. Third, the killing of cattle is both a guarantee of the city's starvation and, where bulls were concerned, a symbolic destruction of fertility and male virility as well. Finally, Pentheus' fate seems to confirm our hypothesis of the thematic unity of all murders. There is, in the Bacchae, only a single ritual dismemberment, a single sparagmos, to use the Greek term, that is reenacted ad nauseum until the pool of suitable victims is depleted. What unites all targets, the herd, the children, and, in the end, the king, what the Maenads are compelled by the god to destroy is, in fact, the symbol of the bull. From the Maenads' perspective, all the victims are bulls because all bulls are theophanies, that is, manifestations of an aspect of Dionysus. When Pentheus is mistaken for a wild bull, i.e. for a symbol of unbridled fertility, the association with the god of the vine couldn't be clearer. Having rejected Dionysus, the women are forced to erase all representations of both him and his blessings, and reassemble the dismembered Thebes as a ghostly double of itself, as a godless, sterile wasteland. Perhaps then, Pentheus' vision of 2 suns and 2 cities was not so much a hallucination as it was a premonition. In the last analysis, the scene where Pentheus is depicted shackling a bull acquires a portentous meaning. The king, having continuously refused to acknowledge the god, is made to enact a symbolic castration of sorts that foreshadows, or inaugurates, in a grim version of a ribbon-cutting ceremony, the self-sterilization of his city that would follow. The image of the king in drag also performs a similar function. Returning to current events, the criminalization of what was once considered normal male behavior seems to mirror the archetypal gesture represented in the Bacchae by the slaughter of the bull. All manifestations of virility are suppressed, and the hysteria that, in the tragedy, blurred the lines between man and beast is today exemplified by the desire to dissolve the distinctions between the male and female personalities. Overt displays of masculinity, that is, of differentiation, condemn men to suffer a similar fate to that of Pentheus who, having stepped too close to the flames, was ritualistically dismembered by the raving cultists. Proponents of affirmative consent legislation, such as that planned in Sweden, leave no doubt as to the reasons behind the new law's timing, with Swedish Deputy Prime Minister and possible crypto-Semite Isabella Lövin announcing, quote, "A new chapter in Swedish gender equality history, not least in connection with the Metoo movement. We see that this is needed." Defining as rape all sexual encounters, except those where explicit consent was expressed, is but a slightly more draconian example of the Quebec University's aforementioned push to label as sexual violence all unwanted male attention. Both amount to variations of the same attempt at social engineering. It is interesting to note that, in the Bacchae, the Maenads are, despite their madness, strangely selective with their violence. How to reconcile the fact that some men are spared and not others? Wouldn't that contradict our claim that a key component in the Maenads' demented rampage is the destruction of all manifestations of virility? Although it is true that Pentheus, the soldiers sent to stop the raving horde, and, presumably, the male infants are all killed by the women, Euripides clearly indicates that 2 men, Cadmus and Tiresias, after visiting the female revelers on Mount Kithaeron, are allowed to return unscathed. Simply put, the 2 old men, and the latter being blind to boot, are well past the point of virility, and thus fall outside the scope of the Maenads, or rather Dionysus' agenda. Pentheus, on the other hand, as the preeminent symbol of male authority, does not. Cadmus and Tiresias, as essentially eunuchs, are allowed to live precisely because they are not differentiated. It is their lack of vigor that saves them from the culling. Undoubtedly, the same criteria is at play today as well, and the newly emboldened organizations onto which will devolve the task of chaperoning male-female interactions in colleges and in the workplace will make sure that the compliant ones are rewarded and the heretics weeded out. While the tragedy is certainly replete with mythical and supernatural elements, here and there Euripides weaves in passages that come as close to historical accuracy as could reasonably be expected of an ancient Greek writer. For instance, in the Bacchae, Dionysus is described as arriving in Thebes from the east, accompanied by, as one translator euphemistically puts it, a chorus of inspired damsels. On 2 separate occasions, these women name Asia as their place of origin, which, to the Hellenic world, included any region east of the Bosporus. This confirms subsequent writers' assertions that the chaos wrought by the Dionysian cult in ancient Greece and later in Rome was due to the intrusion of foreign influences. Bertrand Russell has posited that the sparagmos, as depicted in the Bacchae, represents a ritualized reenactment of Dionysus's dismemberment in infancy at the hands of the Titans prior to his being recreated by Zeus, adding another layer to our central hypothesis. Namely, that in the tragedy, all manifestations of the bull, as theophanies, must suffer the same fate as did the bull god himself. However, it was Apollodorus who, in the 3rd century AD, traced the origins of that primordial gesture the furthest back into the mythical past. According to his Bibliotheca, the Titans who dismembered Dionysus were themselves subdued before Zeus was even born by the 100-handed sons of Uranus. This description bears an uncanny resemblance to the multitudinous hands of the Maenads that eons later so effortlessly tore through their victims. All the above brings to mind Hegel's statement that there is nothing new under the sun. From the sons of Uranus to the Titans, to the putative Eastern Dionysians, to the Theban Maenads, all the way down to the modern hysterics, we see the repetition of similar gestures. Equating a mass movement with hysteria implies, at least in the popular imagination, an element of the irrational that consequently downplays the influence of any specific prima causa. Yet in the Bacchae, as well as within the current rape hysteria, there is no behavior that could conceivably be called insane according to the modern psychiatric meaning of the word, nothing remotely pathological. From Dionysus's perspective, the Maenads' rampage is perfectly logical. It was unleashed for a reason, and its choice of targets corresponds to his personal definition of poetic justice. Only from the perspective of the bystander does the women's fury defy intelligibility. That is, until the god removes his disguise, at which point the Thebans understand the whole picture all too clearly. As a reward for exercising their freedom to blaspheme the god of fertility, their freedom to flout divine law, they were now permitted to reap the bitter fruits of that freedom taken to its logical conclusion. For the barren city gifted the women with the ultimate liberation, from the burdens of citizenship, biology, marital obligations, social norms, from the Logos itself. Indeed, Euripides offers the reader at the end of the play a chilling glimpse into Dionysus's plan for the Maenads now that his work in Thebes is complete. The god summarizes their fate succinctly. For thou must change and be a serpent thing, in the sense of a primordial force of dissolution. Exiled, the women as well as Cadmus are doomed, as if propelled by an invisible hand, to prey on Hellas, dragging their discorporate and haunting forms, with lance upon lance behind them, to liberate other cities as they had Thebes, and to wander eternally. Some say they wander still.